We're going now to a NATO press conference on the effects of this attack. This would probably be going on at The Hague?
Actually, this is in Brussels. They have actually evacuated the building there, but the leaders are standing by. They just finished a meeting. Let's listen.
A defence and security organisation which remains alert, and I can assure you remains resolute and determined as well.
Laurent Zecchini, Le Monde. Lord Robertson, I'd like to repeat one of the questions. The fact that the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American defense, has been hit, do you consider it as a sort of an act of war or not?
Well, I'm not in a position to make decisions about what is an act of war. An act of unspeakable violence took place today. And this is a moment where people are reflecting on the nature of that tragedy and standing firm against that kind of violence and with the people who have suffered from it. What happens thereafter about it will be a matter for alliance consultation, but I don't think that it would be right or proper to jump to any judgments this evening.
I'll take two more questions. Gentleman in the back, please.
Secretary General, do you consider Article 5 to be in application also for terrorist attack or only for state attack?
Well, that is a matter that was considered and deliberated upon at the Washington summit 2 years ago, and you will be able to get from your files what the communique of that summit meeting said on this specific issue, but I'm not willing to go into any of these areas this evening.
This will be the last question, please.
Angus Roxburgh, BBC News. Do you have any initial thoughts about who might lie behind these acts of terrorism?
The Americans don't know, we don't know. But the clear message to whoever it was is that they will have left a trail behind them. And they can be assured that they will be found. And the international community, the whole international community, will be united in condemning what they've done and making sure that they're not in a position to do it again.
Thank you very much. It will be all.
The message from NATO, obviously, that they are all standing strong and together with the United States, trying to figure out exactly what has happened. It's very early on, obviously. They can't coordinate any sort of NATO response until they figure out with some fair degree of clarity who is responsible for this. But nevertheless, NATO, they're saying it stands with the United States, even as they have evacuated their own personnel from the NATO headquarters in Brussels. We have with us on the phone former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. He served in the Bush administration. He's actually with us from Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm sorry about that. Mr. Eagleburger, we thank you very much for being with us. Your first thoughts as to who might be capable of coordinating this massive terrorist attack?
Well, you have to start out with the normal conventional wisdom, which is Osama bin Laden. The point being, I think it's now very clear that this took tremendous planning. It was, in its own way, brilliantly done. The timing was perfect. They did everything very, very professionally. It took money, it took training, it took time, and you have to ask yourself who is capable of that, and you start out with Osama bin Laden. We may never know for sure. What we do know is that terrorism in its starkest form has attacked this country now, and I do think it is as close to an act of war as you can get in this sort of a situation.
Mr. Eagleburger, if you would stand by for just one moment. We have just gotten the first footage of that commercial airline crash in Pennsylvania. It was just about 80 miles from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The first reports were that this is the plane that was part of the coordinated attack. This plane was supposed to be commandeered toward Camp David. Camp David, of course, being the retreat of the President of the United States. It never made it there. It crashed in Pennsylvania, 80 miles from Pittsburgh. However, there was a significant loss of life there. Back to you, Mr. Eagleburger. We thank you once again for being with us. Now, explain to us how the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, and others work together to formulate a response, not only in terms of triage and rescue, but then a more coordinated political response.
Well, first of all, I think we've seen that the planning that's gone on some years now in advance of this event has been put into effect. The President's now in Omaha, for example. So all of this is, I think, clearly based on earlier plans, and they seem to be working quite well. The President obviously now is talking with his principal advisors, although Secretary Powell isn't back from Peru yet. And I'm sure they are now going over the various options of how to deal with this. I think you have to put it in several pieces. First of all, what do we do now to pick up the pieces from this? What do we do to try to begin to find out who did it? What can we learn from this that we will make it possible to prevent these things in the future? That's one whole set of activities that will be carried on. Beyond that, there's the whole question of what do we do in terms of retaliation? What is there that's available in terms of military potential if we decide to do anything? Who should the people be that we look to, that we may want to take some action against? All of this will take time. All of it will take some coordination. But I think there are a whole series of different questions. The one I don't understand, by the way, I can understand intelligence not being able to catch the fact that this whole event was to take place. What I do not understand is how you can hijack aircraft in the United States anymore. I thought we had that licked.
Yeah,
I thought we knew how to deal with that, but it's fairly clear now that one way or another, this is a total failure. And in fact, if we had prevented these hijackings, the rest of this couldn't have taken place. And that's where I think we need to begin to look very hard at what we do and how we do it to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Right, as it was not just one aircraft that was hijacked, but four.
I simply don't understand it. We have always thought for some years now that we knew how to handle this potential hijackers. Whether it was just sloppy procedure or what it was, I don't know. But it certainly cannot happen again.
Mr. Eagleburger, if you would just hang on a second. Joining us on the phone now is Hassan Rahman, who is the chief representative in the United States of the Palestinian Authority. Mr. Rahman, we saw pictures this morning from Palestinian towns and villages in the West Bank of Palestinians celebrating this event. Is this a cause for Palestinians to celebrate?
Oh, absolutely not. It's a day of sadness. We are in deep shock. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this cowardly act against the United States and against the American installations. And absolutely, we in fact believe that the perpetrators of this horrible act should be brought to justice wherever they are.
Mr. Rahman, why should Americans believe you? Why should Americans not believe that the Taliban are saying, oh, how awful, that the Palestinians are saying, oh, how awful, because now that this successful terrorism has been carried out, someone is going to pay?
Well, first of all, why should not they believe me, to start with?
Well, I'm looking at the pictures of your people celebrating.
Well, it's not my people. There are a few kids in the streets who are angry at the Israelis, but they do not understand what had happened in the United States. Those cannot be representative neither of the Palestinian people at large nor of the Palestinian Authority. So we should not really misconstrue the reaction of a few teenagers in the street of Ramallah under siege with the position of the Palestinian people and how we feel in the Palestinian Authority.
Who do you think is a good candidate to look at for the responsibility for these acts?
I think it would be irresponsible from my side or anyone else to speculate at this point. There are American intelligence agencies who are involved in the investigation, and it is only prudent from all of us, and especially from the media, not to speculate and wait until we have sufficient evidence as to who are the perpetrators of this horrible act are.
Can you say, sir, that absolutely there is no Palestinian involvement in these terrorist attacks whatsoever?
I will say that absolutely there's no involvement of the Palestinian Authority or the PLO. Excuse me, I cannot say who is behind this, whoever it is, whether it is Palestinian, American, Latino, Chinese, Indian, Jewish, they should be condemned in the strongest possible terms, and they should be brought to justice.
You can understand how offensive many Americans find the footage of these Palestinians in the West Bank celebrating and passing out candy and cheering and enjoying victory.
I find it offensive myself too, but what can you do? Those are young teenagers. I saw them on CNN, and we should not take them as representatives of the Palestinian people. There are 7 million Palestinians around. What you saw is about 50 or 60 Palestinian teenagers or young guys in the streets who are angry at the Israelis.
Mr. Rahman, who anywhere in the world, in your mind, has such a large grudge against the United States that they would want to carry out such an act?
Again, as I said, it would be very imprudent for me and irresponsible to try to speculate at this point.
Okay, but can you say definitively that there is no Palestinian organization that at least that I want to put a finer point on it, that even has the kind of sophisticated coordination and planning and perhaps even weaponry to coordinate something that is...
Listen, I would say that President Arafat made a statement to that effect. All the Palestinian organizations did the same thing, including Hamas and others. So I have no reason to believe that there is Palestinian involvement in it. And as I said, whoever is responsible, whether it is Palestinian, American, Jewish, Christian, Hindus, they should be punished for this crime.
Mr. Rahman, if you wouldn't mind hanging on just a second. Mr. Eagleburger, you've heard Mr. Rahman. Do you believe that the protestations and the quick statements to avoid blame are to be believed from the Taliban or the Palestinians or anybody?
Well, I think you have to parse it out. First of all, we all know perfectly well that the Taliban has been housing and comforting Osama bin Laden for years. Whether they had anything to do with this immediate event or not, the fact of the matter is they're responsible for having mothered him for a long time. I suspect that I'm reasonably confident that in fact the Palestinians did not have anything directly to do with this. But we missed the point to a degree when we talk this way. First of all, I'm afraid I think a number of Palestinians, more than just children, are pleased by this event, but that's a different matter, though we need to keep it in mind as we think about how we deal with Palestine in the future. But the fundamental point here is if you have played with terrorism, if you are a part of it one way or another, if you have been involved in this whole effort of creating a terrorist state, if you will, and creating the kind of atmosphere in which you can train these people and get them to do these sorts of acts, then I think it's more than time for the United States to decide that terrorism and terrorists, whether they are immediately involved in this issue or not, are our public enemy. They have threatened our national security, and we need to start dealing with terrorism and terrorists as a coordinated bunch, even though they may not always be so. It is time we made it clear to the rest of the world we simply, to the degree we can affect it, are not going to tolerate it anymore.
Lawrence Eagleburger, thank you very much.
All right, we take it now to correspondent Molly Falconer. She has been in one of the, well, she's been on ground zero, so to speak, where some of the wounded have been taken right after the collapse of the World Trade Center. We have Molly with us live. Molly?
Hey, Linda, we just finished up a briefing with New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik. They gave us the latest on the situation, and they still won't put a number on the number of dead and injured. They've been pouring in here to St. Vincent's Hospital, right where most of the wounded are coming. Many are burned. Some have suffered heart attacks, others smoke inhalation. A lot of the people who have been critically injured, 3 have died since we were here this morning and started bringing you our coverage. Many of them are rescue workers, and the mayor was quick to point out that they are interested in saving as many people as they can right now. That is the emphasis of this entire citywide effort going on with what has happened. Now, if you look around me right now, you can see what was the Family Information Center and just people who are on standby. Gurneys out in the street, what has been out there all morning. We hear that there are 260 plus inside the hospital. A makeshift morgue, we have just learned, has been set up a few blocks away, but they are not releasing the location of that yet. We have had some hysterical bystanders who have been hauled away by police. The police are not taking any nonsense around here this morning. We've had a couple people try and break through these barricades that encircle St. Vincent's Hospital. They need to get the patients in and out. They are not taking anything that is anyway in the least out of the ordinary lightly. We saw the police haul someone away. We're also hearing that the mental health hotlines are busy. The rescue workers, the main injuries are they're getting corneal abrasions, we have just heard, because the debris from downtown is falling on top of them, and their eyes are getting scratched. Right now, all emergency personnel, we have heard, are getting helmets, plastic glass wrapped around their heads if they are working downtown, because there is a concern about asbestos, there is a concern about toxicity, and a lot of these rescue workers are getting scraped up. There was a blood shortage here that is under control. They're asking for type O positive. Also, there have been medical shortages as well. Hospital personnel have been going out into the streets to local pharmacies asking them for all the burn medications they have. And if you look over here to my left, you can see some of the hospital workers and some of the 18-wheelers that just got trucked in here this morning to try and get as much medical supplies onto the premises as possible. The ambulances, as you can hear, even though this tragedy occurred hours ago, still going on. They are still coming into this hospital, already working at capacity. We hear the hospital gym has been made into a makeshift ER, as many of the hospitals. There are many as 500 doctors and nurses inside working around the clock. They have a disaster alert on. They're also asking for clothing and shoes from possible donors, because many of the victims have had their clothes blown right off them. We'll give you the latest as we know it. A next update is coming within the hour. Back to you.
Molly Falconer at St. Vincent's Hospital, where the injured have been taken, many injured, of course, and many dead, as the rescue and search and rescue gets underway down at the World Trade Center. Joining us now from Capitol Hill, Carl Cameron, keeping an eye on congressional leaders as they met today to size this thing up. Carl.
Hi, John. Well, in fact, they're meeting as we speak behind closed doors in the Capitol Police headquarters, just off to my left, the right of people's television screens. A bit of a media encampment here as U.S. senators and members of Congress get national security briefings from the FBI, CIA, National Security Council, various different security officials trying to give them an update. And there is a movement afoot between both Republicans and Democrats, particularly in the Senate, to reconvene Congress later this evening. If nothing else, just as a symbolic gesture of American unity and courage that the American people will not be deterred by these apparent terrorist attacks that took place earlier today. The leadership, Tom Daschle, the majority leader, the Democrat in the U.S. Senate, and the House Speaker, Dennis Hastert, the Republican, are in a secure location sort of off campus. They are not at the Capitol, but most of the other senators and congressmen did in fact stay on Capitol Hill, even though the Capitol building itself was evacuated shortly after the planes struck the World Trade Towers in New York City. So as we speak, ongoing briefings and both a political and a symbolic national security decision being made by lawmakers here as to whether or not they will reconvene Congress before the end of today, sometime later tonight perhaps, as a gesture to those apparent terrorists and the world that the U.S. government goes ahead undeterred. John, Linda?
Carl, I got to ask you, is there talk of retribution? Is there talk of striking back? Is there talk of figuring out, even though we didn't know this one was coming, maybe figuring out exactly who's responsible and hitting back?
Oh, absolutely. The rhetoric that one hears from lawmakers talking about this as deplorable and despicable is evident. I'm going to try to put Anne-Marie Willis, our camera person, through her paces here. Forgive us for the quality of this shot because we have some arriving dignitaries as part of this upcoming security briefing. You see, obviously, a large contingent of Secret Service, U.S. Marshals, various officials as they prepare for yet another dignitary to arrive here. About 25 lawmakers, senators and Republicans alike, had a conference call with the Republican and Democratic leadership, who, as we said earlier, are not actually at the Capitol. They are in a secure location somewhere else. And now we see Hillary Rodham Clinton, the junior senator from New York, who is going in for the briefing. Of course, Mrs. Clinton, as the former First Lady, does in fact have her own Secret Service contingent. She doesn't normally have that detail with her at the Capitol, or at least it is very, very nondescript and discreet. Because she wants to appear like the rest of her colleagues to be little more than just an average U.S. senator, if there can be such a thing. But as you see, more and more lawmakers streaming in for this very important briefing, perhaps for them the first definitive information as to exactly what's going on. And yet earlier, when some of them came out to talk to us, it was very clear that the information that they're getting is very spotty. Obviously, the investigation is still only in its first few hours, and the most critical information sure to go to the president and the administration. Lawmakers waiting for any insight, any information. And John, as to your question about talk of retribution, at this point there is across the board decrying of all of this. But as to retribution, lawmakers particularly careful not to make any overt suggestions and lay blame. There are obviously a lot of suspicions that this may be something from Islamic fundamentalists, someone from the Arab world, or the types of terrorists who have tormented the U.S., whether it was in Yemen when the USS Cole was bombed or elsewhere. But they're also cautious to say it's still very early, and that type of speculation could prove unwarranted, notwithstanding all the signals that they are very suspicious that that's in fact where the blame may lie.
Carl Cameron live on Capitol Hill. Carl, thank you very much. The first plane hit the first World Trade Center tower shortly before 9 a.m. More than 7 hours later, there are still flames. We have correspondent David Lee Miller on the scene. David?
Hi, Linda. That's right. At this hour, the fire still continues to burn. You can take a look behind me. You can see a great deal of black smoke, a huge plume of black smoke that you can see throughout all of lower Manhattan. We are told by one firefighter source that a building identified as Trade Center number 7 is in danger of collapse. We are told that engineers have gotten as close as they can to the building, and that this building is on fire, and that there is a chance that this building could give way. And we are told that if it does, they expect that it would collapse in a southerly direction. The World Trade Center towers fell northerly. This would fall in the opposite direction. Right now, they are doing their best to try and contain the situation. Emergency vehicles are on the scene. The streets to lower Manhattan are effectively sealed off to all pedestrian traffic. The only thing allowed down here are a few media vehicles and, of course, firefighters, police, and EMS. Now, Mayor Giuliani held a news conference a short time ago. He said that as many as 200 people have been critically hurt. In total, right now, 600 taken to area hospitals. The big question, though, at this hour, how many people are actually entombed, are trapped in the rubble? Now, we believe that a great many of those who are trapped are some of the emergency workers themselves. I was here shortly after 9 o'clock this morning. Police and fire were racing to the scene, and that, of course, soon thereafter is when the buildings themselves began to give way. I was a few blocks away. One of the buildings collapsed. I ran, as did a number of the police and fire who were in the nearby streets, but a great many officers, New York's finest and New York's bravest, were trapped inside. A number of people fled thinking that they were not going to get out of here alive. Now, if you take a look at the streets in lower Manhattan, they are littered now with women's shoes, and that's because so many people here fled the scene. Women fled the scene. They discarded their high heels, and they just wanted out of here as fast as they could. Now, we are told that the scene at St. Vincent's Hospital has received most of the injured. If you take a look at the hospital itself, outside there are dozens and dozens of gurneys. Most of them are still empty. There are nurses, doctors. I even saw a priest, and they are bracing for a very busy night. And one interesting aside to all this, when I was here this morning, there was a great deal of disbelief about what had happened. It slowly began to turn to shock. A lot of people were crying, and now with each passing minute, more and more people are outraged, and they are demanding some type of retribution. Back to you.
David, just hang on a second. We're going to go now to Neil Cavuto downstairs for an update on the New York markets, and I guess, Neil, maybe the world markets reacting to all of this.
You're right, John. They, no surprise, never opened today, and they're not opening tomorrow. The New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange. I might throw in the New York Mercantile Exchange, which was housed in that left tower there, the one that was on smoke, not the one that was hit by that plane, Tower 1, will be closed tomorrow as well. This is the first time in stock market history they have been closed this long in the event of a national disaster. But the New York Stock Exchange saying it will not open for business. This is as much technical as anything else. The lines that allow for something called cross-trading between the various exchanges and the futures markets, this all seems arcane, are down because the World Trade Center is no more. So there is no effective way now to trade stocks or futures. You can't trade in the metals, you can't trade in the oils. And the better part of valor for a lot of these guys earlier today, those who had connections to foreign markets, was to bid up the price of oil and gold, John. And in fact, those were rocketing today as really one of the few places, or a couple of the few places, to put their cash. But the financial markets, as much really representative of symbolically what's going on here, will not be open tomorrow either. So whoever committed this heinous act today, if the gist was not only to cause tremendous physical damage and obviously a tremendous loss of life, they have also cut the financial capital of the world to the core. It will not be open for business. Indications are now, we're told, from New York Stock Exchange officials that they will try for Thursday morning at the normal time. But keep in mind this will affect global trading because everything pretty much hinges on the big boy in town, New York. Again, the major exchanges closed today. They will be closed again tomorrow.
Neil, the exchanges, the major corporations that are in that building must know something about the survival of their own people. Is any word leaking out from those companies that had hundreds, if not thousands, in that building, what they think or know about the fate of their employees?
Well, you know, it's a good question, John. I wish I could tell you because I have a lot of close friends, many I've known for the past 20 years in my reporter days, having frequently gone to those two towers, who I cannot contact, and I've tried the better part of the day to get in touch with them. We've gotten no word from Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter. We've gotten no word from a lot of folks I know at the New York Mercantile Exchange who trade in the oils and the futures markets that set the price of even the gasoline that we get at the pumps many times. No word from our folks at Cantor Fitzgerald, the big financial services firm, or Keefe Bruyette Woods, the big financial services concern, or Allstate Insurance. No indication as yet how far or extensive the damage was, or how people we've routinely had on this network and on my show over the past 5 years of this network and many years before that are even alive. So when these huge institutions, which play a vital role in the world capital markets, are not being heard from, you always fear for the worst. You hope for the best, but you fear for the worst. And I got to tell you, John, I have many, many dear and close friends and associates and contacts, none of whom I've heard from today.
You know, Anil, we're going to hear a lot more about this in the next couple of days, and we're hoping for the best for everybody. Linda.
Also there is movement from the President of the United States. He apparently has wrapped up a National Security Council meeting that he was conducting by a phone at Offutt Air Force Base. There you see Air Force One in the air. He is headed back to the White House. We learned from Karen Hughes, senior advisor to the President, that Vice President Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice were already at a secure facility inside the White House, as are other senior White House staffers. Apparently, it has been decided that the President will go back there, join them as they continue to formulate a response to this. Another key player here, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, he is not at the White House. He is at the Pentagon, even though there was a plane crash earlier there today. His office specifically not affected, so he remains there. But again, after finishing up a National Security Council meeting via secure phone at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, the President now is en route back to Washington, D.C., presumably headed toward the White House to that secure facility where Vice President Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice are already waiting.
Linda, joining us now, Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who is on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, thanks very much for joining us. We evidently didn't know this was coming. Does that mean we won't be able to find out who did it?
Well, for one thing, I hope there's a wake-up call here, John, because, you know, ever since in the last 10 years of the decimation of our military, along with that is the intelligence budget. So we don't have the intelligence that we need. And I think that that's going to be a response to this tragedy, is that we're going to start rebuilding both our defense system and our intelligence. You got to keep in mind that anyone who would fly an airplane into the World Trade Center would also deploy a missile at the United States. We're dealing with that kind of a mentality. So I hope this serves as a wake-up call to start a massive rebuilding of our defense system and our intelligence system.
Senator, it is not. Earlier, we heard from the chief representative of the Palestinian Authority in the United States. He said they didn't have anything to do with it. Maybe you could say, well, gee, it would be kind of tough for the Palestinians to learn how to fly a 757. But it's pretty easy to identify what countries could train people to fly a 757, to fly it into the World Trade Center after it had been hijacked. That list comes to mind to nearly anybody. Is that who we're going to be looking at?
Well, we don't really know. People talk about bin Laden. They talk about the obvious ones out there. One of the things that I would recall to your attention is the footage that you had on Fox News of the Palestinians celebrating the death of these thousands of Americans just a few minutes ago. And as to who has the capability, you can hire that, John. There are people out there on the market who can do that. This was well thought out, and it's one that was the professionals executed.
Well, so what happens? I mean, do we sit here and say, okay, we've got to investigate this and figure out who it is, and then we'll send FBI agents around the world and gather up the suspects and have a 2-year trial and, like Ramzi Youssef, put somebody in jail? Or do we launch our military might?
No, we launch immediately, but you don't know who. People say, is this war? Yeah, it's an active war, but you can't declare a war until you know who the adversary is. We don't know who the adversary is right now. The first thing that has to be done is learn who the adversary is. It's either going to be state-sponsored or not state-sponsored. At least this would be my opinion. And your response would be different in each way. So, yes, we need to act immediately. I think you're going to see that we have a president who's on his way back to Washington as we speak. He was going to be very decisive as soon as we launch everything we can to determine who it is and who's responsible.
All right, Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma on the Senate Armed Services Committee, thanks very much for joining us. Right now we're going to Professor
Barry Levin. He's of the University of California. He is a renowned terrorism expert. As of course, the main job here at the White House, or at the White House right now, is to figure out who might be responsible for this massive act of terrorism. Professor, thanks for being with us. You have obviously done a lot of study on any organization that could be responsible, that could have the kind of network that would carry out something like this. Who do you think is prime suspect number one?
Well, there are a handful of organizations. I think obviously Osama bin Laden is at the top of the list. Let me just say that we have to look at a couple of things. We have to look at who has a motive. There are tons of people throughout the world who do not like the United States. So there are a bunch of those kind. But who would have the opportunity and the means? That narrows it up a bunch. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing over the last couple of decades has been a decline in state-sponsored terrorism and an increase in these smaller, autonomous, but very well funded and expert organizations like bin Laden. That being said, I'd like to point out that we've been having an air attack going on against Iraq for some time. It hasn't gotten a lot of coverage, but we've been doing overflights practically daily now, so certainly that regime would also possibly have a motive, but right now it's pure speculation. The thing here that I think points to a Middle Eastern connection is the fact that we've seen similar activity like this in the past. Let me give you an example. About a decade ago, there was a plan to blow up 9 American airliners over the Pacific. That was thwarted by our law enforcement and intelligence community. In addition, recently, we've been starting to see an uptick in the anti-American rhetoric, and importantly, too, and this was something that we've noticed throughout those of us who monitor this stuff, that American-related targets were hit in Israel. The Sparrow restaurant was a heavily trafficked tourist destination in a part of Jerusalem that had Americans there. And
all right, Professor, I mean, I understand that, but you have to really narrow it down to which organization. I mean, we're putting pieces together here. Whoever planned this has to have people, number one, who can probably fly planes, but people who are so skilled that they can hijack not 1, but 4 commercial airliners at once. They can get through extensive airport security in Boston, at Dulles Airport in Virginia, at Newark Airport in New Jersey. What kind of organization is that well coordinated that can do this?
Well, I think we have organizations, but the fact of the matter is they have offshoots. So you can have someone who might throw somebody $1 million and say, learn what you have to learn to attack the great Satan, and try and keep enough distance so that it's hard to find out who it is.
Well, let me take you back to this plan. When you were talking about a decade ago, and I remember what you're talking about, there was this plan coordinated to blow up 9 American airliners over the Pacific. It was thwarted. Who was behind it?
Fundamentalists from the Middle East.
Okay.
We're behind that. You know, additionally, look, there are a lot of people who don't like the United States, and I think right now, certainly bin Laden's at the top of the list for someone who has this kind of visceral hatred and the kind of money and planning and professionalism behind him, but I don't want to take out of the range of possibilities the fact that there might be intermediaries who might have been funded by someone who has the money, but not as directly connected as you might think. The new face that we're seeing today with terrorism are these terrorists that are not necessarily state-sponsored, but sponsored by mentors like bin Laden and the like.
Professor Brian Levin, terrorism expert at the University of California. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're joined now by Pat Robertson, coming to us from, I'm not quite sure where you are, Mr. Robertson.
I'm in Virginia Beach.
All right, good to see you. Of course, I think I know your reaction to this. I would expect your reaction to be a total revulsion. But what do you make of it?
Well, John, you know, we operated a television station in southern Lebanon since 1982 that was overrun by the Hezbollah. We've seen bombings. Our studio was car bombed a couple of times. We've been the victim of a mortar attack, etc. So we've seen these people operate. They were funded out of Iran through Syria. I've been twice with Yasser Arafat. Seen how heavily armed they are in Bethlehem, and I was just over in Israel, you know, at the end of July, and I saw what was necessary. The Israelis are under terrific pressure, and I knew they had to move in against the PLO, and when they did that, we would see Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and these other groups come against America. I knew it. I told our staff on Labor Day that it was going to happen, and it happened just a little bit faster than I thought.
Well, Mr. Robertson, I got to say, the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, and they can all drive Ryder trucks loaded with bombs. And they can all go in a building with a bomb strapped to them. In this case, one has to believe at this point, until somebody proves it, that a terrorist got behind the yoke of the airplane and flew it into those targets. Who can do that?
Well, if you have $100 million, you can train a lot of pilots, and I think Osama bin Laden has $100 million plus. There is no doubt that the Gulf Arab states are funneling money into terrorist organizations. As a matter of fact, the Hamas is working out of Dallas, Texas. They had a big fundraiser. They take tens of millions of dollars out of the United States, money laundering out of here. So with that kind of money, you can set up training camps, you can hire pilots, and once an extremist gets the idea that if he blows up the great Satan, he's going to spend eternity in paradise with all those pretty women and everything that they promise them, then getting 4 suicide pilots isn't all that tough.
Pat Robertson, we thank you very much for your time. We need to go now to Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut. He's with us on the phone. Senator, we understand that there has been a meeting at the Capitol Hill Police headquarters of some leaders from Congress. What can you tell us?
Oh, there were between 25 and 30 of us members of the Senate who were over there this afternoon after we evacuated our respective office buildings, just following events and talking to one another, and I think it's important to say that, you know, we're united, obviously, across party lines. The country draws together at a moment like this. Our hearts are heavy. Our prayers go out to the families of those that suffered today. And our resolve is strong. And in the end, we reached out and called Senator Daschle and Senator Lott, our leaders. We expressed those feelings to them, and we urge them to bring us back in a session as soon as is possible from a security point of view, not for a legislative matter or a big open debate, but just to make clear, not to the American people, but also to those who have struck us today, that we may have been hit, but the American government, it's on its feet. and we're together, and we're going to go forward together and find who did this and make them pay for it.
Some individual lawmakers have called this an act of war. Is there a consensus among you?
Well, we live in such a strange age that it's hard to declare an act of war when you don't know who struck you yet. But by every measurement of what we know as war, and even looking back over our history, we have never been hit like this before. You'd have to go back, I think somebody said to me earlier, to the War of 1812 to think about attacks in Washington. And of course, sadly, the deaths that resulted today are probably greater than that. This really is another day that will live in infamy.
Is there a plan for Congress to go back to some level of work tomorrow just to show that the United States government has not been shut down despite these attacks?
Yes, indeed. That's the last we heard from our leader. Very few of us left, although we left the Capitol and our office buildings. And we're ready to go back at a moment's notice whenever the security agencies tell us it's safe to do so. That's the message we want to send out to America, that you know, we're a strong nation and we're going forward. Our hearts are heavy, but we're resolved to show these enemies of America that we're here and strong.
Senator Lieberman, we're here, but maybe as many as 10,000 are Americans. Yeah. That is a huge, huge number.
Hard to imagine, really, that this happened.
And it seems to cry out for action, not for investigation, right, and not for apprehension, and not for trial, and not for jail, but for action.
Right.
What action would you recommend?
Well, that's the complexity of this horrible situation. Obviously, first, you know, if you compare it to Pearl Harbor, we knew who attacked, and we responded. We declared war. Here, we don't really know yet who did this, but as soon as we find out...
Senator Lieberman, I apologize for interrupting you. We have news coming out of Israel. The Israeli government now speaking about these terrorist attacks. Shimon Peres at the podium explaining what's going on. Let us go there. I understand he's with us now. Mr. Peres, thank you for being with us.
Yes.
What is the Israeli government response to this? Who do you believe is responsible?
We feel that we have to handle every source of terror, to identify countries that host or supports terror or terrorism and declare them as countries of terror. I think we have to turn to all the religious leaders to denounce suicidal terrorists. Look at the damage they brought. And then our heart is with the United States. Each of us feels today like being an American. Our heart are with the families, with the wounded people. But in spite of it, may I say, America paid a very high price, but America remained the only country that can save the world from this terrible jungle-like introduction.
Sir, it was reported. Sir, it was reported earlier today that the Israeli government believed that this was the work of Osama bin Laden. Is that true?
No, we don't have definite information, and we are not going to blame or to guess.
The Palestinian representative, PL, here in the United States has said that there is absolutely no clue, there's no indication that any Palestinians were involved in this attack. Do you agree with him? Do you believe him?
I think it's a day for the Palestinians to take the opportunity and divorce terror from their own midst. It will help them. Let them go back. Let us come back to the table of negotiations. With terror, nothing will be achieved, because it doesn't matter who is just responsible for this case. Everybody who is engaged in terror is endangering humanity, is endangering normal life. And we have to really combine forces, because until now, you know, we have had armies without enemies. Now we have dangers without an army, without a strategy. We have to get ourselves organized globally, because terror is global, and bring an end to this terrible form.
Mr. Peres, did you have any word through your intelligence service that there was an attack coming on the United States? Did you have any sign?
Not specifically. And any information we would have, we would hand it over immediately. as we just now sent our rescue team from the Army. We have one of the best in the world. They're on their way to the United States to participate and see if we can be of any help to save even a single life. We have also announced that tomorrow it will be a day of mourning for all the Israelis, because as I told you.
Shimon Peres speaking to us live from Israel. We thank you, sir, very much for your time.
Let's go now to outside Pittsburgh, where our correspondent Steve Goldblatt is. Jeff Goldblatt is standing by at the site of that crash of the. Jeff, it's a United Airlines plane. It's believed to be at that site outside Pittsburgh, isn't it?
That's exactly right, John, with 45 people total on board. And one of the more profound things today, the imprint of terrorism seared not only on Wall Street but also on Main Street. Here you have an area 80 miles to the southeast of Pittsburgh, and this plane, which went down at about 10 o'clock this morning. We have rescue vehicles that came in earlier in the day, and they have turned up nothing. No one believed to be alive from this crash. Some of the media just getting back to the scene, which is about a quarter of a mile up on a hill back behind me, and so some of the first pictures just starting to come in within the last hour. I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire, just a couple of people walking around. They looked like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet. Long and probably about 10 feet long or 10 feet wide.
What could you see on the ground, if anything, other than dirt and ash? And
you couldn't see anything. You could just see dirt, ash, and people walking around, broken trees.
You're more familiar with this area than I am, being from Chicago. The Somerset County Airport, it's just about 80, just a little ways away from here. Do planes typically go across this area, as far as you know?
Commercial jets usually fly across this area, but they're usually up probably 30,000 feet.
Okay, Chris Kanicki, thanks so much for that insight. We're here, John and Linda, throughout the afternoon and evening, and we'll be providing you updates. We're expecting Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge to be here shortly in press conferences throughout the evening. Now back to you in New York.
Jeff Goldblatt, we thank you very much. We have new footage coming in of the terrorist attack on the Pentagon. Firefighters still trying to fight the flames. This was part of, as you know, part of the outer ring, the E-ring is what it's called, where the plane went down. It was actually a United Airlines flight, and it was near the helipad. It destroyed several layers of the building, and fire spread actually from the outer ring to some of the inner rings. However, we should make it clear that the Secretary of Defense is still there. He's still able to work. He's still able to coordinate with the Vice President and the National Security Advisor, who are in a secure facility inside the White House. The military command center in the basement is still functioning. They're coordinating military response. So a significant portion of the Pentagon, a symbol of military strength, has been severely damaged. However, the nucleus of the Pentagon still operates.
Linda, we go from the Pentagon to New York again. World Trade Center number 7 on fire. This is the one that David Lee Miller told us a little while ago has been on fire as a result of the crashes and the collapse of the 2 towers, and is now in danger of collapse itself. It would be, the fire officials believe that if it does become so unstable that it collapses, it would collapse to the south in Manhattan, where the towers collapsed to the north by and large, and so we're keeping an eye on World Trade Center number 7, which is down in the immediate area of the two trade towers, which collapsed. All this a result, of course, of 2 commercial airliners who were hijacked and then flown into the World Trade Center towers this morning about 9 a.m. It took an hour for those trade centers to just crumble, fall apart, and collapse. And still, no really good idea of how many of the 50,000 people that work in those 2 towers managed to get out. Not quite clear. And simple logic tells you that they probably all didn't, and that there must be a very, very large number of people who died in that collapse. Linda?
Back to the Washington angle of this. As we have reported, President Bush currently in the air. He's on his way back to the White House. He will join his National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and the Vice President in a secure facility at the White House. They will be coordinating with the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who is at the Pentagon at this hour. There is also a National Military Command Center working in the basement. They are coordinating a military response. We go to Colonel Bob McGinnis, who is with us in Washington, D.C., retired military officer, to explain a little bit more of what the military does here. Colonel, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Linda.
Let's go through some of the plans that have been put in place by the U.S. military. Number one, they have deployed a number of Navy ships to deal with search and rescue, to deal with triage. What exactly happens there?
Well, Linda, you've seen a host of things happening around the country that normally you don't see. You don't see F-14s, flying around Washington like you did today. You don't see DEFCON 4, where all the military installations across this country and 140 nations around the world have been shut in, and they're looking out, expecting imminent attack. That's the sort of thing that the military is prepared to go to. Now, in the basement where Secretary Rumsfeld and his chiefs are sitting, they're looking at all the intelligence that's available from the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, etc. Now, what's unfortunate here is you've obviously had a failure of human intelligence, which, of course, as you heard earlier, has been cut back radically over the years. Now, that failure, of course, is going to hamper our ability to quickly identify, except through forensics, perhaps, who it is that we ought to go after. You've heard about Osama bin Laden. You've heard about the Palestinian leader who spoke. The markings, though, the symbolism here of striking the Pentagon, striking the World Trade Center, and perhaps striking Camp David, if that was the target, that sends a clear message, perhaps, to those of us that are watching some of what's happening between Palestine and Israel. And having just come back from that part of the world, I will tell you, tensions and the dissatisfaction with the U.S. is at the highest I've seen it in 3 decades.
Colonel McGinnis, what dissatisfaction? I mean, what is it that everyone is so ticked off at the U.S. about? Is it the Israeli-Palestinian problem, or something deeper, wider, farther, more widespread?
Well, John, that's part of it. Clearly, we give over $3 billion to Israel every year. The Israelis have been using our modern weapons to kill Palestinian leaders, and ostensibly they've been going after even some of those that are connected to Palestinian or Hamas leaders in Palestine. Now, the other part is, of course, there's dissatisfaction, even according to polls and leaders in Europe, about the whole issue of national missile defense, about
but you're not saying that dissatisfaction about missile defense would lead to someone from northern Europe to hijack planes and attack us.
John, all the markings are that this is a fundamental Islamist circumstance where you have hundreds of Islamic groups, and many of which are very radical, but as some previous guests have indicated, they don't necessarily have the money, they don't have the wherewithal, as you pointed out, John, on 757 flights. It takes the deep pockets of Osama bin Laden and cooperation, perhaps internally within the U.S., of sympathetic organizations that could provide the mechanism. But the security of our airport is seriously in jeopardy here, because obviously at least 4 breaches, significant breaches of that security have taken place to enable this to take place.
Colonel McGinnis, hang on just a second. I should tell everybody that as we watch these pictures and discuss this and what happened, that President Bush is in the air from Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha and is on his way back to Washington. And he will address the nation tonight. We do not have an exact time, but when the president is back on the ground in Washington, he is going to address the nation about today's 4 terrible terrorist attacks, 3 of which actually struck the targets that they were intended. One of them, the hijacking that wound up in Pennsylvania, evidently did not get the intended target, although we're not certain what that target might have been. Maybe Camp David, maybe the Capitol, maybe the White House itself. It ended up in Pennsylvania in a crash. Meanwhile, 2 planes struck World Trade Center, 1 more struck the Pentagon. We now have to figure out how those planes were hijacked, how they were piloted, who did it, why, and what we do about it as a nation.
We are due to have some more information literally in the next couple of minutes from American Airlines and United Airlines, obviously involving those 4 airliners that were hijacked and all crashed. More than 200 people were aboard those planes. They have all perished. Many more believed dead at the attacks on the World Trade Centers. We will have live reports in just a moment.
And I'm John Gibson, along with Linda Vester, as we continue to cover today's terrible events. Terrorism hits America, hits it at the World Trade Center. Both towers hit by hijacked airliners, piloted, one assumes, by the terrorists. There you see the picture this morning from about 9 o'clock. A 757 hitting one of the World Trade Center towers. Both of those trade centers later collapsed. Also, one more hijacked airplane struck the Pentagon, and one more hijacked evidently did not hit its target and ended up crashing in Pennsylvania. It was thought perhaps it was headed towards Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland.
The President of the United States is in the air. He is on his way back to Washington, due to arrive at the White House to join his Vice President, his National Security Advisor, and other top staffers who are in a secure facility inside the White House. He will coordinate with the Secretary of Defense, who is currently in the basement of the Pentagon. We go now to senior correspondent Rita Cosby. She has more late-breaking information from Washington. Rita?
Linda, Fox News has learned that American Airlines, which had 2 of its planes hijacked today, was just fined only months ago for $99,000 from the FAA for failing to apply appropriate security measures on 6 of his flights. Now, this is significant because 2 of those flights departed from Boston's Logan Airport. Today, 2 flights that were hijacked left from Boston's Logan Airport. One was an American Airlines flight. Another was a United Airlines flight. Now, in the screening, FAA special agents determined last year that American Airlines transported unaccompanied luggage. Also, they failed to check passenger IDs. Remember, unaccompanied luggage is when they were supposed to associate a bag with a particular passenger. They said that they did not do appropriate checks to make sure that bags were associated with a particular passenger. They also failed to ask proper security questions. This is obviously significant because a lot of focus is already on the FAA and also particular airports and airlines as to how these individuals may have gotten on board these planes. The other thing that's significant, we're told that the ground stop, of course, all the planes are now grounded domestically in the United States. They're all on the ground at this point. Several of them, international flights, are still flying to the West Coast. We're told just a handful are still in the air, but there's nowhere that there are any problems on board those flights. But the ground stop will be in effect until noon Eastern time tomorrow at the earliest. It will not be lifted before that. And after that happens, they are saying, the FAA, that there will be indeed many extra security measures in place. And certainly American Airlines and United Airlines will be looked at very heavily. And as Fox News has learned, American Airlines was just recently, just 2 months ago, fined for failing to apply appropriate security measures, allowing improper passengers on flights, not checking properly, and also with luggage as well. In addition to this, law enforcement sources are telling me that all the focus is still right now is the prime suspect, and again, they stress just a suspect, but all signs, they say, are still pointing as to Osama bin Laden as most likely being the candidate behind this, him and his group Al-Qaeda, which has been behind a number of additional attacks. They are saying that this group, and particularly Osama as a mastermind, are really the only ones that seem to have the specificity, the sophistication, also the coordination to carry out this type of attack. Law enforcement sources are saying no one has claimed responsibility, which is typical of the case when bin Laden's group has been involved in all the prior attacks that they believe he's been responsible for. He has never claimed responsibility. So I believe they're seeing a pattern of sophistication. And they do know that he was training pilots, was training suicide pilots in addition to other types of suicide bombers. So he certainly had the capability to carry this out. But at this point, nothing is firm. But that's where all signs are pointing towards, according to law enforcement.
Rita Cosby in Washington. Rita, thanks very much. Let's go now to James Baker, former Secretary of State, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Mr. Baker, we are looking at the people who survived this thing on the video, but there may be upwards of 10,000 people who did not. It is a huge, huge number. What does the United States of America do?
Well, it's a terribly tragic event. In my view, it moves us into probably another era, one that we've feared for some time would get here as far as our vulnerability to terrorism is concerned. And some of the things that we're going to have to do is to beef up particularly our human intelligence capabilities so that we're able to penetrate these groups. We've let those slide ever since the mid-'70s, and somehow we've always been it's always been a little offensive to us to do the kinds of things you have to do to be a clandestine spy and penetrate those groups. We're going to have to get back into that messy business. We're going to have to beef up our security measures. I just heard a little bit of your program before you came to me, and it's quite remarkable in my view that these people were able to get on these airplanes, pass through security, get their weapons on there, take control of the airplanes, get into the cockpits, and in 3 out of 4 cases, fly the planes into the targets they intended to hit.
It is amazing. Mr. Baker, I hope I'm not the first one to tell you this. We are going to learn over the next few days, many people we know have died in this thing.
That's right. No, you're not the first. I'm very aware of my close friend and Ted Olson's beautiful wife, Barbara, who died in the crash at the Pentagon.
Yes.
And that's very, very sad to me because she was not only a friend and colleague, she was someone with whom I spent a very intense 37 days down in Florida this year.
Yes. Look, we have had other terrorism incidents strike the United States, and you know, some big numbers of people, dozens, many dozens, hundreds, but this may turn out to be a few thousand.
Well, I think well, in my opinion, it will. We don't know that yet. We've had, of course, we've had other strikes at U.S. interests here recently that created a lot of casualties. The bombing of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the bombing of the Khobar barracks in Saudi Arabia. We've never had one like this on the soil of the United States, nor particularly one as massive as this. We've always been able to roll up other attempts.
Well, my question is, let's just say hypothetically you could figure out it was Osama bin Laden. He is being harbored by the Taliban. He had to have somebody help him train these pilots. Not any old Cessna pilot can go fly a 757. They had to somehow spy and figure out how to avoid security. They had to do a lot of things that involved probably a lot of countries. Should we strike a list of countries who were involved?
Well, it depends on how much direct proof we have of the involvement of the countries. If we have direct proof that these actions were supported by state-sponsored terrorism policies in other countries, then we may very well want to do that. A lot would depend on what we find out. I've always been of the view, quite frankly, as terrorism has begun to build and as the risk to the United States has increased, that we ought to take a hard look at the provision of U.S. law that says we don't assassinate anybody. If we've got somebody out here masterminding an attack that kills 10,000 or 5,000 or 3,000 or whatever it is, innocent Americans in America, then it seems to me that it calls for rather drastic measures.
You would, just to put it bluntly, would target individual leaders if you could establish that they had a connection to the act of terrorism.
If you could establish that they had a connection to the specific action, to the terrorism, you establish that without any question, and you were in a position to deal with it, to deal with them in a surgical way so that you're not killing other innocent civilians in the process.
James Baker, a former Secretary of State, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. today. Thank you very much.
Fox News has just obtained new footage of the collapse of one of the towers of the World Trade Center, as you know. First one commercial airline, then another slammed into those two towers this morning. A short while later, one tower collapsed, then another. This now home video footage we want to show you.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help. I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Yeah. Can I get a toot? I'm seeing a couple of clean breaths. That's good. Okay. Back to you.
It is a terrifying scene. We are told by those who operate the World Trade Center that this morning, shortly before 9 a.m. Eastern Time, when the first plane slammed into one of the towers, that the building was at full capacity, meaning that somewhere around 50,000 people were inside those two towers. We don't know a number yet of how many people were hurt. There you see the second plane slamming into the second tower. It did not take long for a chain reaction of events, including a massive fire inside the tower, to occur. And then one tower collapsed, then the other. Now we know that part of the World Trade Center complex, Building 7, is also on fire at this hour. It is in danger of collapse. We have a correspondent there. We will be checking with him. There is also a tremendous disaster all around Lower Manhattan. 10,000 or more emergency rescue personnel have been brought in. They've been called in. All taxi cabs in New York City have been commandeered to ferry rescue workers down to that area. At the same time, the Navy has dispatched a number of ships to New York Harbor to help with the rescue operation. Hospital emergency rooms around the city and beyond completely in chaos.
We are going to go momentarily to a former ambassador to NATO, but before we go to Ambassador Robert Hunter, let me introduce on the phone Kelly Quill, who was an eyewitness to both Kelly Coyle. Kelly Coyle. You saw both planes hit both towers, and you saw both towers come down. Tell me about it.
I went to work this morning. I worked for Solomon Smith Barney, and we're located at 7 World Trade, and I'm on the 43rd floor. And we were just sitting there today, and we saw the first plane hit the building. And at that point, I really did not know what was going on. It didn't look like an accident because it looked like it was a direct, that they were aiming it right at the World Trade Center. But then there seemed to be like explosions, so people didn't really know. There was a lot of debris hitting the windows. People panicked, but they stayed put. And originally I thought that we stayed put for about 5 minutes, and then the second attack hit. But now I find out that it was actually 18 minutes. So it's funny, how time flies.
Okay, now Kelly, plane number 1 hits, plane number 2 hits, and then there's a lot of fire. And
mass hysteria, people running down the stairs, just trying to get out.
Kelly, I apologize for breaking in. Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, now speaking about the terrorist attacks. Let us go there now.
Assistance at any time. The government of Israel has declared a day of mourning tomorrow as we bow our heads and share in the sorrow of the American people. תודה רבה לכם.
All right, it was very brief, but you got the essential message there from Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, basically saying it stands with the United States, and in a show of solidarity, tomorrow in the state of Israel there will be a national day of mourning.
Ambassador Robert Hunter joins us now. He's a former ambassador to NATO. He's now with the RAND Corporation. Ambassador Hunter, we are, we keep hearing people say we've got to figure out who did this. We've got to figure out who did this, and they said that after the Oklahoma City bombing, and it turned out to be something much different than what people expected. In this case, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a Tim McVeigh behind this, does it? It does seem to be a either state-sponsored or quasi-state-sponsored act of terrorism, doesn't it?
Well, the marking so far is that this was a foreign group, but it could very well have been Osama bin Laden. With money from various places, but it didn't necessarily require the state to do. I think the essential thing that's happened with this tragedy today is whoever did it didn't realize who they're dealing with. This is a day that will live in infamy. This is like another Pearl Harbor, in which we're already seeing today the extraordinary way in which the American people across the country, and certainly here in Washington, certainly in New York, have been pulling together. And I think whoever did this is going to regret this dearly.
Okay, but what does that mean? I mean, we pull together as a country, we stand united, we stand tall, we go on, we do all that. But there is a tight-jawed anger and demand for something serious to be done. What do you think that will be?
and I think it will have to be done. One reason I think the government have been so cautious today was precisely what you said that happened in Oklahoma City, where a lot of people got it wrong. A lot of people had to be involved in what happened today. Going through 4 airports and hijacking the planes, being able to direct them the way they were, choosing planes that were full of fuel for the greatest impact. This will come out if we have any intelligence capability at all, and at that point, just as the Japanese found after Pearl Harbor, the United States will have to use whatever power it can to bring these people to justice or to take direct military action. There's no more ifs, ands, or buts about that, and I think the nation, this government, opposition, everybody together, I think, is united on that point, and those who did it are going to be brought to justice.
Ambassador Robert Hunter, former ambassador to NATO, now with the RAND Corporation, thanks very much for your view. Let me go back to Linda Vester. We have a live picture from down near World Trade Center number 7, I think, Linda.
And just a reminder, President Bush is due to address the nation live via national television a little bit later this evening. With us once again, former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. Mr. Eagleburger, we heard just a short while ago, Shimon Peres of Israel said that they had no advance warning. They have an extensive intelligence network. They had no specific advance warning that this kind of an attack was coming. The United States has the NSA, it has the CIA, it has the DIA, and the FBI. How is it that these sophisticated agencies could not get advance warning of an attack?
Oh, I think there are any number of reasons for that. First of all, this clearly is a sophisticated operation, very sophisticated, very professional. I suspect that it was kept in the hands of very few people and that they are extremely dedicated, and they simply didn't leak. I shouldn't say it's simple. It's not. Under normal circumstances, you would have thought that we would have been able to get some intelligence on it. But if they are really as competent as they seem to be and as careful as they seem to have been, I could understand why we couldn't get information on it. I don't like that fact, but I at the same time can't feel terribly upset because we didn't, because in cases like this, often we don't get these things.
You know, we were listening to James Baker, your colleague, and
Right.
He was saying earlier that he thought that perhaps the United States government needed to revisit this law, I believe it is, that does not allow the United States to assassinate an individual, even if the United States has definitive information that a certain individual had something to do with a massive loss of life.
I must say to you, ma'am, I have believed for a very long time that it was wrong. It was during President Ford's administration, I think, when the executive order was issued. I have thought for a very long time that ought to be eliminated. We ought to be able to carry out the kinds of activities necessary under really circumstances like this. We ought to be able to do what's necessary to protect our country now.
Well,
it ought to be very carefully constructed so that it can't happen all the time, but I very much believe we ought to change it.
Well, I may be getting a little ahead of myself here, but how exactly would that be reversed if there is a decision that executive order really no longer applies in this current terrorist world?
I think the answer to that is if the President issued the executive order, another president can issue a second executive order removing the first one. It doesn't take that much, frankly.
You know, Mr. Eagleburger,
yeah.
I thought that maybe it's not something the United States has the ability to monitor in real time, but looking back, isn't essentially every phone call on the planet recorded by some national security agency? Can't we go back and look at who Osama bin Laden or any of these people were talking to anytime they were talking to?
Well, I'm sure that if...
Do we have that capability?
I think as a matter of, they certainly have the capability, and to go back and look at it, I suspect, is going on right now. But, you know, again, here are thousands and thousands of phone calls. It's not easy to pick up, but it's a lot easier to pick it up after the fact than before it. There's no question about that.
So I guess what I'm getting at is that even if we don't have the real-time intelligence, or we have not spent the money necessary to have, as you put it earlier, the messy business of spies, do we have the capability of going back in sort of a forensic fashion and figuring out who did what?
We may well have. Again, it's going to depend to a great degree on how closed-mouthed these people were. If they were as professional as they seem to be, it may well be that there is no evidence. But on the other hand, there is also no question that you can go back and not quickly necessarily, but you're going to very often establish precisely the kind of information you're looking for when you know what's already happened, but you can't do it beforehand.
Mr. Eagleburger, hold on just a second. Richard Shelby, the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, is speaking now in Washington. Let's listen in.
Families that were lost today, and we should be, but we've got to realize that this is a wake-up call for America. A lot of us have been talking about terrorism, counterterrorism, how to deal with it. We live in an open society, and we're not going to live in a bunker, and we shouldn't. And I'll see what goes on in this meeting in here, but I think the bottom line is we were basically caught flat-footed, and we've lost a lot of people, and that's sad.
Who's responsible, Senator?
Well, I'm not here to blame anybody. I'm just here to say that we've got to do better.
Based on what you were told today by your first tenant and based on your briefings in the past, do you think it was been monitored?
I can't say that, but a lot of things point to it was either. I would think it would either be Osama bin Laden's cell or some other cell similar to it, or akin to it, or spin-off from it. But I can't say that yet. Maybe later today there'll be some more specific information.
Insofar as some of the terrorist groups have made a point of criticizing American policy towards Israel, is it...
Let me interrupt right here. Richard Shelby talking. Building 7, the World Trade Center number 7, has collapsed. It was expected to go, and it finally has. So that is 3 buildings in New York City that have collapsed in today's terror attacks.
We should clarify that Building 7 was not struck with anything. This is actually part of a chain reaction that began when the 2 towers of the World Trade Center were hit by those 2 commercial airliners, caught on fire and then collapsed. So this is part of the chain reaction, simply as it continued to sort of devastate buildings around the area in Lower Manhattan. Once again, this is basically a state of emergency in Lower Manhattan as they try to rush rescue personnel to the scene.
And down there, standing beside our camera, is our correspondent, David Lee Miller. David, fill us in. David Lee Miller, can you hear me?
Let's go, please. Back it up.
Oops.
Let's go.
All right, they're telling our correspondent, David Lee Miller, to get out. So as we watch the Trade Center building number 7 collapsing, and the police are moving the camera crews, get out, get out, get out. Let me there's still more live pictures of this. Let me speak to Richard Suttmeyer, who joins us. He is a frequent guest on Neil Cavuto's show and is in one of the buildings down there. Richard, is that your building, the one that just collapsed?
No, we're in 59 Maiden Lane, which is right opposite the Federal Reserve.
And you had to walk down, what, 32 flights?
Right.
Could you tell, because we've all been trying to figure out, of the 50,000 people who work in those 2 towers that collapsed, could you look out on the street and make a judgment as to whether a significant number of them managed to get out?
It's hard to believe that a significant number of them could have gotten out. Maybe in the 18 minutes between crashes, maybe some of them got out of the second
How long did
building.
it take you to walk down 32 flights?
I took it slow, obviously, and when I got down, I took a nice big drink of water, and I thanked God that that I'm alive, particularly since we almost moved to that building a few months ago.
There goes the building. There's a picture of the building collapsing just moments ago. We finally got the tape in. That is Trade Center building number 7. It was involved, I guess you would call it collateral damage here. From the original collapse and fires of the 2 Trade Center towers, and moments ago, our fire department here in New York lost it, and it collapsed. Richard, I'm just trying to get a couple of... How long did it take you to walk down 32 flights? We're trying to judge how long it would have taken somebody on the 80th floor of the tower to get out of the building before it collapsed.
No, a lot of people passed me because I'm a big guy, so I wanted to walk slowly going down 32 flights. It took me about 20 minutes because they already had the doors locked down on where I had to get out.
Richard, also, if I can jump in, just so people understand, who was in the World Trade Center. There are some small offices that nobody might recognize, but then again, there are also companies that a lot of people recognize. I mean, from everywhere from Avis car rental to Lehman Brothers, the investment house, to Delta Airlines. Who else?
Well, Morgan Stanley has quite a few floors, like 10%, and Cantor Fitzgerald is on the upper part of the first building that was hit, and that's an interdealer broker with screened prices, and I've known them for 30 years. I'm going to be very sad when I see the list of people who didn't make it out of the building. It's going to be the next time I break tears, I think, with this situation.
Richard, we're talking about 10,000 people. It's just a rough guess.
It's got to be more than that.
You think? Okay, Richard Setmeyer, thanks a lot. Hold on just a second. Let me go now to Senator Chuck Hagel, who has been conferring today in D.C. about this horrible day of infamy, perhaps not just a day of infamy, but the day of infamy. Senator Hagel, has the State Department got any clue what happened today?
Nobody does, John, except to say this was a very sophisticated effort. I think we all recognize that. Resources, intelligence, people that came together in a very precise project and effort to do this terrible, terrible terrorist act. That's what we do know. Now, we will unfold this, and we will pull it apart, and we will get the facts. And when we get those facts, there will be punishment. But right now, what we must do is what we are doing, in fact, is securing our country and all our national security interests, helping those we need to help, pray for the families and those loved ones who have been lost. And then we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us, John.
Senator Hagel, if I can ask you to just stand by with us for 1 second. We need to quickly get a report from correspondent David Lee Miller on the collapse of building number 7 of the World Trade Center. David? David Lee Miller.
Chaotic. Just a few moments ago, World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. Earlier, we had been warned by firefighting sources that the building was in danger of collapse. Engineers were on the scene. They say the building was structurally very weak. It was in flames. It was on fire since this morning. And just a few moments ago, the entire building gave way. From my vantage point on Reed Street in Lower Manhattan, it appears the building fell south, which is the opposite direction that the Twin Towers fell. This had been predicted throughout the afternoon, and it had prevented a number of emergency workers from getting close to the scene. Nevertheless, up until a few moments ago, we saw a virtual parade of emergency vehicles on their way downtown. Suddenly and without warning, the building gave way. Everything came to a standstill. A huge plume of smoke went into the air and began to barrel northerly in our direction. The police asked us to move our live truck and our cameras and lights and equipment, and we, the authorities, literally fled about a block and a half north to stay out of harm's way, and we're watching the smoke slowly continue to move in our direction, not knowing if this is going to cause any further injuries. I believe that building, as I said, was empty at this time because authorities knew that it was very, very much in danger of collapse, and things went the way that the authorities feared. Back to you.
And David, just to clarify, that building number 7 is much, much smaller than the 2 towers that we saw collapsing this morning.
That's absolutely right. I don't know how many floors it is, but in comparison to the World Trade Towers, excuse me here, it looks almost like a mid-rise building, but it was an important building to the city of New York. It had a number of important city offices, including an emergency operations center of some type, and it's going to make the cleanup down here yet even more difficult. Because to put all this in perspective, Linda, as you and I both know, what we have here really is a city. You've got 50,000 people that worked in these buildings every day. Many Americans don't live in communities that are that big, and the damage here is just devastating.
Now, David, before I let you go back to Senator Hagel, just quickly, has there been any progress in getting into the area of the 2 towers to start looking for people in there?
I asked one of the firefighters that, and we're not allowed close to the actual tower site. What was once the World Trade Towers. I'm told that they're trying at this hour to get to those who may be trapped in the rubble, but it is extremely, extremely difficult. So to what, if any extent, they're able to pull people out of the rubble at this time, we really don't know for sure, but I can tell you that it's going to be a very, very long night here.
All right, David Lee Miller with us live from New York City, and back to Senator Chuck Hagel. Senator Hagel, you probably have access to more detailed information about what happened this morning than we do. Have you been briefed on what the FAA knew about hijackings before the actual attacks on the building? Because we've heard that the FAA had early information of a hijacking in progress.
I am not aware of any of that specific information. We've been briefed, some of us, throughout the day. I just spoke to the Acting Secretary of State, Rich Armitage, a couple of minutes ago. As you know, Secretary Powell is on his way back from Latin America. And so we've gotten periodic updates, but no one has been able to put all the pieces yet together. We will, but not yet.
Senator Hagel, you know, I hate to sound like obsessing on this, but I just think that we can't lose sight of it for a moment. The huge number of people that undoubtedly died here. Won't there be an almost unstoppable cry for a pound, if not a ton, of flesh over this?
John, no nation can allow this kind of cowardly terrorist act of this enormity, this immensity, as you mentioned, to go unpunished. We will get the facts. We will be sure of those facts. And when we have those facts, we will do something about it. Now, one of the things that might come out of this, John, is a new coalition of the civilized world, focusing, putting the resources on dealing with terrorism. As great a power as the United States is, as we found out today, we can't do this alone. We need all the civilized world with us, and we need to deal with this. This issue, terrorism, is the scourge of our time.
Senator Chuck Hagel, thanks very much for the latest from your vantage point. Let's go now to Rear Admiral Eric McVaden of the Institute for Policy Analysis, who joins us from Washington. Mr. McVaden, we all want to know who, how, why, and what to do about it. Where can you start?
Well, I think you identified just exactly the problem. Of course, a lot of people are asking, so how do we strike back? How do we both defend the U.S.? And by the way, I don't think we've seen F-16s and F-15s flying over the Washington area like this ever in my lifetime.
Nor over downtown Manhattan, I'll remind you.
Indeed. But what I think we're looking at, and in the coalition that Senator Hagel spoke of, is an intelligence challenge, and maybe we need that sort of concerted effort among all of the civilized world there. But I think we have an intelligence challenge now at two levels. First, just exactly as you described it, to say who did it, but then to be able to determine whether there are going to be future attacks or what the future threats are.
Well, Admiral, there's two approaches to this. You figure out who, and then you say, do we take the cuddly approach? Why are they mad at us, and how can we make them happy with us? Or do we take the opposite approach and say, we hit them hard, make them so frightened of ever doing such a thing again that it doesn't happen? What's the approach?
Well, I don't know what the approach is, because you've identified the dilemma exactly. And, you know, let me describe it in terms that the Chinese often do with me in North Korea, and say what you should do is be able to get along with the North Koreans better, and you'd eliminate the threat. Well, that's much easier said than done. I think it's a balance between the two, and that we'll have to cope with that for all the time that I can foresee.
Admiral Linda Vester with you as well. Yes. Just a question about what it means that the Pentagon and actually, as we understand, naval forces along the entire East Coast are under threat-con Delta. Can you explain?
Well, that's simply going to the highest state of alert so that we attempt to both be ready to cope with anything, but also for force protection means, and so that we ensure that we do not get yet another very unpleasant surprise.
Right. So we have multiple Navy ships now dispatched, some of them to the New York Harbor to help with the rescue. How much training do those aboard those ships have for this kind of incident?
Well, of course, I've heard that there might be a hospital ship that's going, and so that would certainly have something there. But, yes, people are trained to cope with emergencies and so forth, but I guess I take some pleasure, if there could be any such thing derived in this kind of situation, to know that once again the country looks around and says, where are our aircraft carriers? So it makes me proud of my years in the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
All right, Rear Admiral Eric McVaden, thanks very much for joining us. You may want to stay on the line and listen to this. We're going now to our senior correspondent in Washington, Rita Cosby, who has new information on the possible Osama bin Laden connection. Rita.
Yeah, John, I just got off the phone with two law enforcement sources, and they are telling me that they are getting strong indications that Osama bin Laden and his organization of Al-Qaeda, which is based in Afghanistan, along with bin Laden, may be behind this attack. What's interesting is that they're saying, my sources, are that they have strong indicators. They would not say specifically what those indicators are, but they're saying it's much more than just speculation, when a lot of people have believed that bin Laden may have been tied just because he had the financial resources to do this, the capability, the widespread network all over the globe. But my sources are telling me that in addition to just the obvious, that they are getting some severe and very strong indicators pointing in that direction. They're saying that at this point it is not enough to be, to go right out and say that they definitely did that, but they're saying that they are almost to the point where they are almost certain that they are behind this attack.
Rita, if I can ask you a question about this, we don't know any details, but we're all making a fairly informed estimate that it was not the scheduled pilot that flew these planes into the trade towers or the Pentagon. Who in Osama bin Laden's world can train people to fly 757s?
Well, there are actually a number of them, frighteningly, and in fact, intelligence sources were telling me earlier today that they actually have a couple of training grounds right there in Afghanistan where they are training suicide bombers for planes, i.e. 737s, 757s, 767s, also private planes, and also other types of bombing attacks. And, of course, intelligence sources firmly believe he's been behind the USS Cole attack. That was where a small boat pulled up alongside the USS Cole and it exploded. But they said that they have gotten some intelligence information that he was indeed training people on some American commercial jetliners, and that he was capable of doing this. And in fact, I remember around the time of the Millennium strikes, remember all the preparations that were being made and the strikes that were thwarted by U.S. officials at that point, there was in the mix the possibility that there might be multiple hijackings on U.S. soil, and it would have involved some Algerians with ties to Osama bin Laden. So this is something that the U.S. government was aware that Osama bin Laden had been training for, at least in some sort of capability. No one I've spoken to today ever anticipated that it would actually happen. They all seem to be taken very much by surprise that something would have happened on U.S. soil. But they certainly did know that he was training individuals. And also law enforcement sources also tell me that they, in addition to this, saw some activity around bin Laden's camp in the last 2 weeks. And this was the same type of activity that we were reporting right around the time of the possible Millennium strikes, that they saw increased activity around his camps, where he was sending out some of his leaders, the ones right below him, to sort of delegate to other surrogates around the globe. What happens with Osama bin Laden, his network is so widespread that normally it's about 4 or 5, sometimes 6 or 7 layers away from him are the actual individuals who carry out the attacks, and often they don't know who they're carrying out the attacks for. So they try to keep it so Osama bin Laden, it doesn't point directly to him. He never claims responsibility for his acts, and they seem to think the same thing may have taken place here. But indeed, right before the Millennium attacks, they certainly saw a lot of activity around his camp. Some of his key men were being dispatched to different locations around the globe, and they said that indeed they did see at least some activity around his camps in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, and some indications. Another thing we reported earlier today, on June 20th of this year, Osama bin Laden's followers released a videotape of Osama bin Laden saying that he's going to hit them where it hurts, and they talked about hitting targets in U.S., also in Israel. So there were some indications that he was going to go after his followers, go after his enemies, and go after them with a vengeance. But now I'm being told, John, from law enforcement sources that it is much more than just sort of the sense that he was capable of carrying out this attack, that he had obviously the financial resources, certainly the infrastructure around the globe, but that they are getting strong indicators pointing in that direction. Right now, not 100%, but getting strong indicators pointing there.
Rita Cosby, if you would stand by, we have more information coming in. We've gotten word that there's a convoy of military vehicles in Washington, D.C., passing through the section of Washington known as Georgetown, working their way west, headed towards Georgetown. No indication as to what exactly they're planning to do, but that just coming in, being confirmed. Also, President Bush is due to speak to the nation a little bit later tonight. At this moment, he is in the air, heading back to Washington from Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. That is where he stopped. He touched down. He held a National Security Council meeting via telephone. And then he gave this statement before getting back on the plane and heading to Washington. Take a look.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President George W. Bush now on his way to Washington, D.C. He will address the nation a little bit later tonight. The time to be determined, but you will see it here live on the Fox News channel.
Linda, the president talking about the victims, one of the victims we know by name, Barbara Olson, who appeared on this network many times. It is now being reported on the wires that she spoke to her husband, Theodore Olson, twice during the hijacking using her cell phone, and she told her husband that the hijackers were using knife-like instruments, and they further declined to describe the conversation. Barbara Olson killed today in the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. Joining me on the phone now, Colonel David Hackworth, America's most decorated living soldier. Colonel Hackworth, America evidently wants to go to war about this. How do we do that?
Well, you know, having lived through Pearl Harbor and remembering that terrible day, and the end result of that is how it galvanized the nation, and I suspect that all Americans will come and stand tall, and we'll finally get the national security apparatus, that's the generals, the admirals, the president, and all of the people that are responsible for the security of this country, to get their heads out of a very dark place and start waking up. I have for 10 years, John, even on your show we talked about, said the threat is terrorism. In the meantime, we build defense shields to stop missiles and buy more bombs and more aircraft, but not address the problem. While the FBI goes almost barefooted, who are the mainline defenders in this thing, while the intelligence community doesn't get the kind of money and the funding and the backup that they need to do the job to stop terrorism, we're preparing again for a 20th century war in the 21st century.
Colonel Hackworth, are you saying that we should be... hold on, Colonel Hackworth. Hillary Clinton is speaking now. Let's listen to the senator from New York.
I can't wait.
All right, hang on a second,
Hillary and I are here today to express our solidarity with the people in New York and America. First, we completely are appalled, shaken, but also resolute as a result of this awful action. This is Pearl Harbor, 21st century, and it's an unknown enemy, although they will be known, attacking civilians. First, to the families of those who may have losses, and so many calls we received today from people who couldn't find loved ones, didn't know where they were. We feel your pain. I know for an hour I couldn't find my daughter, whose high school is in the shadow of the World Trade Center, and praise God I was able to find her, and she and my wife, who works downtown in New York, and my other daughter are safe. So our first feeling is for the families and the suffering and the pain that goes on in New York and throughout the country. I spoke on behalf of us to the President this afternoon. He wished me to convey to New Yorkers that he will do everything possible to help the rescue and the recovery and what needs to be done in future years and months, because this loss is just a terrible loss that will not go away soon. He also expressed a second point, which we share, and that is that those who did this must be brought to justice. For too long, the world has just shrugged its shoulders at terrorism. But we now know that none of us as Americans can avoid that terrorism unless we take strong action against it. And I express to the President, on behalf of both of us and all of the Senate, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with him in this fight. That no one will try to seek partisan or geographic or any other advantage. We will be united in this fight, and we will do everything we can. We cannot have a month-long or a year-long fight against terrorism. We have to have a permanent fight against terrorism, because this is the new form of warfare. And so, the few things we ask people: first, for prayers. Second, anyone in America who can, through their local authorities, give blood. We are desperately short of blood. We need doctors who can contact the authorities if they live within a days of New York. We are short of doctors. And of course, FEMA and the urban rescue teams, as many as our nation has, are being sent immediately. America can never turn back from this point. And we are in a new era where we realize the world is an interconnected but sometimes very nasty place. We have to be prepared for it. And so, two things. One, love and caring for those who accepted loss, and help for those who need some path to recovery. And second, resoluteness, that we will never let this happen again, and do everything we can, and some of the steps won't be easy, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Well, Chuck and I wish we could be in New York, but that's not possible. And we've been in constant communication with the authorities, with the White House, the governor's office, the mayor's office, with the emergency officials. And I think that it's clear to everyone this was an attack on America. It may have been directed at New York, but it really is attacking everything we stand for in every part of our country. And I'm very proud of the way New Yorkers responded. The behavior of the people on the ground, the emergency resources, our police and firefighters have just been extraordinary, and many of them were put in harm's way because they were doing their job. Our medical facilities, all the hospitals in the immediate area, are overwhelmed. We are moving non-critical patients out of hospitals in the city, out to Long Island, even Westchester, in order to make room for those who have been in. We do need more blood. We need doctors and nurses and other medical professionals who would be able to support those who are working so tirelessly. We appreciate the federal resources, certainly the search and rescue teams, the National Guard, FEMA. We've been assured we will have everything we need to conduct the various phases of the reaction. First, of course, is to find any who might have survived. Second is to find every body of anyone who has not, to do the hard work of sifting for evidence, and then for the task of rebuilding. This will be a monumental undertaking. This was a nerve center of communications, of infrastructure that affects not just our nation, but the entire world in terms of the access to and transfer of information. We're also deeply concerned about the attack on the Pentagon. We just had a conference call with our Senate leadership, bipartisan, Senators Daschle and Reid and Lott and Nichols. We also heard from Senator Warner. He and Senator Levin are at the Pentagon, where they have gone to do everything they can to support what needs to be done, and they were certainly very confident that our military forces are as alert and ready as they need to be. So there is an enormous amount of very good, solid work being done in New York, in Washington, throughout the country. I would just reiterate, there is absolutely no need for anyone anywhere to panic. This has been carried out in an orderly and effective manner, but we have a lot of work ahead of us, and that work includes the identifying of those who are responsible for this cowardly and evil act and holding them accountable wherever they might be, however long it would take.
Do authorities have any idea who is responsible for these attacks?
I think they do, and they're not prepared to say yet, but I have spoken to both FBI and CIA today, and they are certainly not clueless.
We step away from Senators Schumer and Clinton to give you some new information. We are expecting a number of briefings very shortly. One from the mayor of New York City. Also, in about 15 minutes from now, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, is due to brief in Washington. Shortly before 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and possibly other members of the cabinet will also brief. They will be at the FBI building in Washington, D.C. With that, we want to let you know what is happening in New York City. The National Guard has been called out to Lower Manhattan trying to help with the rescue. It appears that hundreds of police and firefighters are missing from the ranks of those who were sent in to respond to the first crash. We go now to correspondent David Lee Miller, who is near one of the buildings that has just collapsed. David?
Linda, we're on Church Street, and this really is ground zero, only a few blocks away from what was once the World Trade Center. The attack began a little over 9 hours ago, and just a few minutes ago, we saw further proof of its devastation. We have some incredible videotape that we should be taking a look at right now. This is number 7 World Trade Center, and as you can see, this building that authorities feared throughout the day might collapse did so just a few minutes ago. It fell in the opposite direction of the World Trade Center. It fell in a southerly direction, and when it did, a huge plume of black smoke went up. Authorities anticipated that. We were warned it might happen. They gave us special masks to wear. They were wearing these special face masks, but as the plume of smoke began to grow larger and in our direction, they asked us to relocate, and authorities moved us up north about a block and a half, and now what was once building number 7 is also gone. The New York City skyline dramatically changed in just now the last few hours. Now, as for how many people may have died, we still do not have anywhere near an estimate. We do know, according to the mayor of New York, 200 people critically injured, 600 now in the hospital. Countless victims still trapped in the rubble. Authorities having a very difficult time getting to them. It is believed that it could take now up to a week before authorities really get an accurate measure of how many people died in this tragedy. As proof of the panic, if you go downtown here on Church Street in front of what was once the World Trade Center, you can see that women's shoes, high-heeled shoes, litter the street. People in a panic, desperate to flee, abandoned their shoes and just ran away from the devastation as quickly as they could. For a while, even the mayor of New York, Mayor Giuliani, was trapped in a nearby building for 10 minutes on 75 Barclay Street when the 2 buildings collapsed, when he was here to inspect the damage. Now, at this hour, we have seen emergency arrive. I saw just a parade of all types of emergency vehicles. The National Guard is here, and Linda and John, one of the National Guardsmen, made a very interesting point that up until now, I certainly did not realize today's date. He said 9/11. Back to you.
David, the video we were watching just moments ago is hundreds and hundreds of people running as fast as they could run. Does that give anybody hope that a lot more people than we now think made it out alive?
I don't think so, John. I think it's certainly very dramatic tape, and I think it shows that there was a lot of panic, but I have reason to believe that a great many firemen and policemen are trapped in that rubble. They arrived at the building to try and help people who were inside, and when the buildings collapsed, it is believed a great number of New York's finest and bravest died at the scene. I can tell you because I was here this morning a few minutes after 9 o'clock, and when the buildings began to collapse, it was a very dramatic scene here on the streets. The white cloud of smoke that spread in my direction caused myself and the police to run as fast as we could in the opposite direction. But at the end of the day, I think we're only now just getting a small glimpse of the extent of the damage. Back to you.
Correspondent David Lee Miller. David, thank you very much. This just in, it has been confirmed that President Bush will address the nation at 9 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, 6 p.m. Pacific. You will see it here live on Fox News Channel. We take it back to correspondent Catherine Herridge. She is at one of the triage centers in New York City where they are trying to care for the wounded who've been taken out of the World Trade Center. Catherine.
Linda, in the last few minutes, we've had a briefing from officials here at St. Vincent's, which, as you said, is the closest trauma center. They're confirming to us that they've taken 297 patients, among them approximately 45 who are in critical condition. Also among that total, 42 rescue workers. They told us, fortunately, that many of them just had minor injuries, for example, abrasions to the eye because of heavy concrete dust in the air. They also confirmed to us that they've had 3 fatalities, 3 deaths there. When we asked them what was the cause, their understanding is that it's a result of significant blunt injuries or in some cases perhaps falling to their deaths. Now, just to give you a sense of how busy it is here right now, in the last few minutes we've had about a dozen ambulances, and as you can probably see behind me, we have some large truck here now, and there is some concern that the hospital could run out of water, so they have brought more water to the area. At this point, they're telling people in the city that if they can give blood, they should do so. They should not, and I repeat, this not come to hospitals in the southern portion of the city because they are, of course, dealing with the injured. They should go to centers in the northern part of the city. Now, earlier this afternoon, we also had a briefing from New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani as well as the Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik. They confirmed to us that already 200 members of the National Guard are in the city. They are expecting about 1,500 this evening. The city remains on a high state of alert. New York's mayor also commending the residents here for their bravery and for their dignity. He said it's his belief that because they have kept a calm presence of mind, that there have not been more injuries. And I quote here from the mayor, he said, "New York City is a lot stronger than this. We're going to overcome it. We're going to be an example of how to stand up to terrorism. It's important for people not to be afraid." And there are just a couple of anecdotes I want to share with you. Earlier today, as I was trying to make my way down to the World Trade Center, I had an example of how people here have really pulled together. I was on foot trying to make my way down, and I saw a fire engine from Long Island, and I flagged them, and they let me into the cab to take me down. And I asked them, what is going through your mind as you approach a disaster like this? And this sort of calm silence settled over the cab. And then one of them turned to me and said, "You know, your mind is really just blank. You just have to go in there and help people." And what was significant, he said, was not just the people who may be trapped in those buildings, but also your co-workers. And that really came home to me about an hour later. I saw a firefighter coming off of Gold Street, which is where I was just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. And I asked him what the scene was there, and he said, of course, both the towers had collapsed, and he had 8 of his members unaccounted for, still unaccounted for at that time. Back to you.
Catherine Herridge at St. Vincent's. Linda, as you and I leave this and leave it to Shepard Smith and Brit Hume, Mayor Giuliani saying today, quote him, "I have a sense it's a horrendous number of lives that were lost. At this moment, we just simply don't know how many because they can't get to the rubble to look."
They are still tallying the number of injured. We do know that it was more than 200 who were aboard the 4 different commercial airliners that were hijacked and then crashed. 2 American Airlines, 2 United Airlines. More than 200 people dead. We are beginning to learn some of those names as well. They will be friends not only to us, but many of you watching. We're going to continue our live coverage round the clock here on the Fox News Channel. We will be having a briefing by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in a matter of minutes. A statement from the Attorney General shortly, a little bit later this evening. And then at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. President Bush will address the nation live on national television. You will see it here live on the Fox News Channel. For John Gibson, I'm Linda Vester. We turn it over now to Fox News Live coverage.
Good evening, I'm Britt Hume. This is the time of night I normally would be saying welcome to Washington, but Washington this day is a place where not even the President of the United States was considered safe. The Pentagon is on fire after a terrorist attack. The Capitol and nearly all other federal buildings were evacuated. Warplanes patrol the skies above here, and warships have been dispatched to the Potomac River. The President, after spending much of the day in the air aboard Air Force One for security reasons, is now on his way back here and plans to address the nation tonight. This after a day like no other in this city or this country's history, a day where even the extraordinary events that occurred here in Washington were overshadowed by the horror of what took place in New York, where my colleague Shepard Smith is standing by. Rick Leventhal is standing by. Rick Leventhal, give us a brief update, if you can, of the scene there in New York and what you've gone through.
Might collapse, and indeed it did just about 30 minutes ago. World Trade number 7, a 47-story office tower adjacent to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, came crashing to the ground. It had been involved in flames for several hours, and there were flames inside the building. And in fact, it did, as I mentioned about 30 minutes ago, come crashing down. So the skyline of New York City continues to change. And you see deep smoke, thick smoke down Church Street. We're just a few blocks north of where the World Trade Center complex is located. Still flames on the ground, still flames in the rubble of what's left of the World Trade Center, which is slowing the search for survivors and the recovery of the dead in this monumental terrorist attack.
So, Rick, we now have 3 buildings down in New York. The first 2 trade towers we saw went down as a result of direct hits by flying aircraft, and now this 3rd building, which is considered just tower, I believe we call it tower number 7. This has been a day when the President of the United States learned of these events while at an event in Sarasota, Florida, an education event. This was a normal day. The President out. He was talking about his education program, his education proposals. He was whisked away from that event, put aboard Air Force One to go we know not where, and then after stopping at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, making a videotaped statement there at the Air Force Base and leaving it behind, he went on his way and was in the air for much of the rest of the afternoon, bound for an Air Force Base in Nebraska. We didn't know he was going there. Perhaps he didn't either. Brian Wilson is standing by at the Pentagon to bring us up to date on what has been going on there and what is expected to go on there as the evening wears on. Brian?
Britt, I think you can see over my shoulder that there is still smoke smoldering up from the ruins of the south side of the Pentagon. It happened at 9:40. A United Airlines jet slammed into the south side of the Pentagon, penetrating the E, D, and C rings. All people aboard inside the aircraft were, of course, killed, and we have no firm numbers about how many people inside the Pentagon may have been injured or killed. We do know that, however, the work of the military is still going on, and it is being directed from this building. In the basement, there is something known as the National Military Command Center, and we understand it is up and operational. In the next few minutes, we are expecting a briefing from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, where he will give us the latest information about what is going on. But I must tell you, Britt, it has been a day of chaos, a day in which we have had not great information, in which members of Capitol Hill have criticized the intelligence community for having no advance warning of these incredible, horrible attacks in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. So here at the Pentagon, the cleanup continues. You see over my shoulder, the damage is still smoldering. And I must tell you that initially a lot of the building withstood the impact. It was only after a great deal of fire and a moment when the firemen had to move out of the area that the building you see behind me collapsed to the state it is in right now. But we are going to hear from the Secretary of Defense, and this is a very tough building, and deep within the bowels of the Pentagon, the largest building in Washington, the military is still being directed and operations continue. Britt?
Brian, I still see what appears to be smoke rising from the building over your left shoulder near that great cavity that we see in the wall of the building. May I take it that the fire, if not out, is at least now under control?
It is contained, and what you're seeing are the smoldering ruins, but they still continue to cool with their fire trucks. The fire really got to rage for a while because there was such concern there might be a second plane on its way that they pulled out even the firefighters after the first attack. So the damage from the fire was fairly substantial.
All right, Brian Wilson there at the Pentagon. Brian, thank you very much. We've been, before we talked to Brian, I was mentioning that the United States had spent much of the day in the air, hopping from one Air Force base to another, finally stopping there near Omaha at Offutt Air Force Base, which is that used to serve as the headquarters of the old Strategic Air Command. and he is now headed back to Washington. But this was a day in which his advisors were to some extent split on what he ought to do and how he ought to handle this situation. I'm joined here in the studio by our senior White House correspondent, Jim Angle. Jim, obviously this was a day when many people in the country doubtless felt they would like to hear from their government, and particularly from their president. They did via videotape. They have not since this morning otherwise heard from him. What went on that we know about?
Well, it was a very difficult day, obviously. First you have the shock of what had happened, but then the president's advisors, his political advisors, were saying the president needs to get back to Washington. Obviously, the country is upset by this, and there's a certain amount of panic that enters in when you see people being killed, people leaping on fire out of flaming buildings. What the advisors wanted to do was bring him back to show the president in charge, to show the nation that the government is functioning, that the president is at the helm. Secret Service, however, wanted to take the president to NORAD headquarters at Cheyenne Mountain near Colorado Springs, which is inside a mountain, several feet of steel doors protecting it, originally against nuclear attack. That's where they wanted to take the president to keep him safe. They said they could not guarantee the president's safety if he were in the White House and a hijacked airliner crashed into the building. That would leave them in the position if someone took off, let's say, from Bermuda and flew toward the White House. The Secret Service says we would have to decide whether or not to shoot that plane out of the air.
I gather, though, how the matter has been resolved in favor of bringing him back here for remarks to the nation tonight. We expect at 9 p.m. In the meantime, in New York City, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who, of course, has had to preside over all efforts that are being made for research and recovery and further security, is giving a briefing. Let's listen.
People of the city of New York should act differently. We should act bravely. We should act in a tolerant way. We should go about our business, and we should show these people that they can't stop us, and they can't. Governor?
This is obviously still an ongoing effort to deal with the consequences of this horrible disaster. I want to commend the mayor first and his professional team. I don't think there's any finer group in America or the world, and they're doing an excellent job. And we're proud to have National Guard and other state resources here helping as well. I want to thank my colleagues, leaders from the surrounding states. I've heard from virtually every governor, and we're getting help from Pennsylvania and Connecticut and New Jersey to deal with specialized needs to respond to the crisis that we still face. The goal right now is very simple. Everything that can be done to save every single life is being done, and we will continue to make sure that that is a priority. But we're going to get through this, and we're going to get through this strong. And just about an hour ago, I was out on the street in front of Cabrini Hospital, and you see from all walks of lives, more than a block long, waiting in line to donate blood to help the victims of this disaster. It's that spirit. It's that pulling together and that refusal to be intimidated in the face of this horrible terror that's going to make sure that this city, this state, and this country come back stronger than ever, and that the freedoms that we are entitled to have as Americans will not be lost because of this terror. So, Mayor, again, we're here. We'll do everything we can to make sure we work.
Barry, you want to say a few words from the FBI?
I'm Barry Moore with the FBI. I'm the Assistant Director. As the Governor and the Mayor just mentioned, we have taken the investigation. We'll take a back seat to obviously number one concern even for us in law enforcement. Generally speaking, it's going to be coordinated, is being coordinated by FBI in our headquarters. We have the various offices already actively engaged where some of the planes were hijacked, such as Boston, where it crashed in Somerset, Pennsylvania. We're doing all of that. The lead office and coordinating office will be the New York office, with the primarily because of the Joint Terrorism Task Force that we have here with